Anti-Semitic attacks in the United States and a military spending spree in the United Kingdom. The EU goes after pornographers while France betrays its national character. We'll discuss it all today on the Compact Podcast. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. On June 1, Mohammed Sabri Soleiman, an Egyptian national who was in the country illegally, threw incendiary devices at a group of protesters gathered in Boulder, Colorado, wounding 12. His targets were calling for the release of Israeli hostages seized by Palestinian attackers on October 7th. His motive? According to papers filed in federal court, he told authorities that he wanted to kill all Zionist people and wished they were all dead. During the attack, he shouted, "Free Palestine." Those same words were used by Elias Rodriguez after he shot and killed 2 employees of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., as they had left a gathering hosted by the American Jewish Committee. His victims, Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky, were engaged to be married. According to charging documents, he shot them from behind. As Milgram tried to crawl away, he continued shooting her. He informed police, "I did it for Palestine. I did it for Gaza." How has it come to the point that American Jews are being hunted in the streets and burned in public parks?
Oh God, where to start with this? It's so awful. You know what's very interesting is at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, world leaders were sort of saying, "Oh, we've got a problem here where the public of all of these different countries don't really have enough of a problem with everyday Russians, with Russian civilians. And we really need to make they don't like the idea of sanctions hurting everyday Russians. What have they got to do with anything?" And then you had October 7th, and no such problem arose immediately, in spite of the fact that Israelis were the targets of this attack. Immediately, people came out expressing their glee at the harming of everyday Israeli civilians, and there's a number of reasons for this. One, obviously, maybe it's not obvious, I don't know, but the Israel stands for the West and has done so for a long time. And so what happens if a negative thing happens to Israel, and it's like a hit against the West, and a lot of the so-called progressivism, I don't even know what to call it, but what used to be the left, what used to be progressivism, has descended into this awful anti-Westernism, anti-liberalism, anti-1789 kind of discourse. And so they see Israel as a symbol of all that, and the East as this, it's like a kind of quasi unintentionally racist discourse against the East as well, where it's like, this is the bastion of goodness, and you can fight against misogyny in the West, but you're not going to fight against it in Afghanistan or something like that, because that's just their culture, kind of. I'm giving a caricature here, but you understand this. This is a sort of it becomes this huge uh, this fight against the West, and a stand-in for capitalism and so on. And so then it becomes quite easy to make this jump to just anti-Semitism, which is this where Israel becomes a stand-in also for Western capitalism. And there was a few years ago, there was this huge, well, I'm sure I don't need to remind you, but there was one of the things that brought the downfall of Jeremy Corbyn was anti-Semitism allegations. And if you looked through some of the discussions that were being accused of being anti-Semitic, it was it was the socialism of fools. It was bad analyses that scapegoated people, bad people, for why we. So there's this complete loss of processual thinking, of thinking about problems as arising out of process, and this scapegoating of people that was very very easily lent itself over, slipped into anti-Semitism. And then this combined with a discourse of whiteness, where whiteness became scapegoated for everything that's wrong in the world, where it's like, you have there was just this furore recently about theater, some like actors that were forced to go through this. You think that this is a thing of the past, right? I feel like wokeness is like it's receded, but apparently they were forced to sit through this like training on, the that centered like the global majority as against whiteness. So if you were like white, you had to take part in this training, but if you were part of the quote unquote global majority, you didn't have to, which is like quite easily slips into anti-Semitic thinking, because it's like there's this group of people whose racial origin lends them to have certain um, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like connections with each other and scheming amongst their race as against the global majority who they oppress, which is totally stupid because obviously around the world, I mean, I should not be so inflammatory, which is rather lacks nuance because around the world you have uh, all sorts of small differences between this group and that group that leads people to fight each other and oppress each other and so on. It's not like white people that turn around. But just to sort of give one final anecdote to round out this rant, I remember many years ago, I was on this listserv for Indigenous psychology, and because I had published a paper on criticizing actually the way that Indigenous people are framed within psychology, and over the years, the listserv, this is all academics, had descended into this white people do this, and white people are the reason why we can't have nice things, and white people control the world and move things in their favor. And I just thought to myself, I could download this and hit like, find, replace in Word and put Jews in. And and we would have regressed massively. And why are we doing that? It's because it's this loss of thinking about social problems in terms of process, and instead thinking about it in terms of malevolent individuals who hoard power. And that is the basis of anti-Semitic conspiracy. And I said at the time, we are going to see the return of anti-Semitism brought forth by this language of whiteness. I think this underlies the reason why you had this in Russia. People didn't really see everyday Russians as a problem, but with Israelis, you can attack American anybody in America was anything closely related to Israel, and they're fair game, they're targets because of this inching toward this racial discourse where all of these people are essentially they are responsible for the problems in another country. um, it becomes this kind of racial scapegoating, and it speaks to our loss of ability to think about things systemically that leads to this kind of scapegoating of individuals and slipped into anti-Semitism very easily.
So I will sort of push back against. I'm not sure either of you are suggesting this, but I find the way that acts of violence are used to discredit particular ideologies usually pretty easy to refute or dismiss. And you've seen people on the right saying, "Well, we see where this whole kind of thinking leads." So, I mean, one problem with this is, well, a larger anti-Semitic attack in recent years was the Tree of Life synagogue massacre in Pittsburgh, where the shooter was, proceeding from an outlook that pretty closely resembles one that was endorsed by Elon Musk 2 years ago, which is essentially the idea that Jews are behind a kind of great replacement conspiracy against white people. And, roughly the view that Elon Musk infamously endorsed when he said something like that is the truth, or you have said the truth, was more or less the same view that the shooter in Pittsburgh was proceeding from in 2018. So the point is, you can easily come up with counterexamples. And I guess my problem, and I would maybe slightly distinguish these two attacks recently. The one in Colorado, in terms of the profile of the perpetrator and the nature of the incident, is seems a bit more reminiscent of the types of attacks we've seen quite a few of in Europe, and maybe relatively fewer of in in the U.S. Whereas the shooting in D.C. seems very. I mean, on one hand, it's somewhat novel in that the perpetrator seems to be a kind of millennial socialist type who's been involved in several socialist organizations and sort of left wing activism. And I think there actually haven't been. People thought maybe that was the profile of Luigi Mangione, but then it turned out he was kind of more this like odd rationalist, sort of message board, like Reddit atheist type or whatever. Um, and and so the profile of the DC shooter you can sort of trace to this millennial left kind of outlook, but that's actually relatively novel. I don't think there's anybody else who quite fits that profile among recent perpetrators of violence. So that's sort of significant. But the way I usually think about this is, at least in terms of the American berserk of endless spectacular displays of public violence, I tend to think it's more the violence looking to attach itself to ideologies than ideologies driving anybody to violence. That we seem to, you can really run the gamut. You can find perpetrators of these spectacular attacks informed by pretty much any or no outlook at all, in terms of who if you just look, take a sampling over the past 10 years, I can find right wing people, left wing people, people who seem to have no coherent ideology whatsoever, and it's not particularly hard. So I tend to just think that the consistency is the nature of the violence itself, and the thing that distinguishes each act is which sort of worldview the violence attaches itself to. So that's sort of how I tend to think about it in the American context, which I sort of do think is a bit distinct. Whereas I think in Europe you've had more just people of roughly the profile of this Colorado attacker, recent migrants, who have some kind of outlook that's informed by the broader outlook of their community, perhaps, or the countries that they come from. Egypt is certainly, interestingly, despite just my understanding of it is, on one hand, it's a close sort of ally and military partner with Israel. On the other hand, its sort of official propaganda apparatus is deeply invested in these very, anti-Zionist kind of outlooks and kind of conspiratorial accounts, and that's sort of part of how the regime weirdly legitimates itself. But I don't know a huge amount about that. But the point is that this perpetrator, we can assume, an Egyptian national who came to the U.S. relatively recently, was kind of steeped in this worldview from a very early age and lived in an environment in which that was the sort of standard default way of thinking about things. This conspiratorial anti-Zionism. Whereas the American perpetrator, I tend to think of as somebody who, is more isolated, is more characterized by a kind of sense of disconnection and a lack of connection to a broader shared worldview, and so is motivated actually by the search for some sort of way of making sense of the world that expresses a deeper kind of alienation. So I sort of, yeah, I mean, it seems very schematic, but I would distinguish these two acts, and I haven't looked into the profiles or biographies of the two perpetrators all that much, but the DC perpetrator seems to me to fit this American outlook of somebody who's ultimately not informed by a kind of broadly shared um, sense of political values, but rather a sort of the sort of lone figure who carries out this sort of passage to the act, where there's the act of violence and then it attaches itself to a particular worldview. And the worldviews are sometimes, like in this case, sort of well suited to that. In other cases they seem kind of weird, like the Mangione case. It's actually kind of bizarre, like nobody can quite connect the dots between how he seemed to think about the world and what would have motivated him to do to do the act of terror that he committed. But nonetheless, that's kind of how I would look at it.
And looking at events like this, I tend to be less interested in the ideological professions of the attackers than I am in the justifications of violence subsequently offered by professional ideologues or pundits. I think that's a more interesting place to look in terms of the ideology. Um, many attempts to contextualize or even minimize these two recent attacks have pointed to the staggering destruction Israel has unleashed on Gaza. But hatred for Israel, and especially for the Jewish Zionists who support it, existed before Israel had so much as lifted a finger in its defense. On October 8th, I attended one of the first pro Palestine protests in Times Square, reporting on it for Compact in an article titled "Millennial Socialists Embrace Atrocities." Pretty dark title. I described how one speaker declared, "Our heroic resistance continues to prove that we will never sit idly while our people are colonized, brutalized, and ethnically cleansed." The speaker, a young Arab woman, told the crowd, "We uphold the right of our people to resist colonialism and imperialism and to return to our land by any means necessary." Um, at the same time, we saw attempts on that very day, the very day of the attacks, and the day after, to minimize them from prominent left wing commentators on social media. Noah Colwyn, who was then a contributing editor of Jewish Currents, compared the attacks to John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, laudatory comparison for him. Meanwhile, Gabriel Winant, an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, said that criticizing Palestinian tactics was, quote, politically meaningless, unquote. So, we can't settle these ideological debates by reference to the violent acts, but I do think that whenever you have someone uh, you know justifying violent acts of this type, that it's people are likely to take note and in many cases to hold it against them.
Can I just say, not to sort of misunderstand my point, I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk like this or have these sorts of ideas that I mentioned kind of slip easily into scapegoating and so on, and socialism of fools and all that, because this sort of thing is going to happen. I'm saying we shouldn't talk like this because it's a poor understanding of the world. Um, and these acts are the ultimate example of that poor understanding of the world, but not necessarily like I'm not saying let's pro no, I'm definitely not saying we should prohibit this kind of talk. I'm saying we need to argue against it, and argue against the logic that leads to these kinds of acts that are represented by this logic. But also, I don't think that the two acts that you mentioned, Jeff, are as different as you say, because on the one hand, recipient countries of migrants have absolutely pandered to this idea that at least Islam is untouchable, and um, at least if not the whole sort of government, particularly Trump's government, but at least the political class, large portions of the political class have been absolutely complicit in undermining principles of free speech and protest, in relation to Islam. And there's a case that came out today that a man was found guilty of a public order offense for burning a Quran, and the judge said, how do I know that this was a grossly offensive act? Because you were stabbed when you did it. Because he was assaulted. And there's a video of this person who has a blade attacking this guy, and he got arrested. The man who was attacked got arrested. Like, that is the government basically saying, yeah, if you do this, if you blaspheme against this one protected group, then you deserve what's coming to you. Like they're pandering to this sort of thing. So I yeah, yes, these people are isolated, but at the same time, it says, like, yeah, I'm in the right here, and all you people who don't agree with me, you deserve what's coming to you.
Keir Starmer has promised to bring defense spending to 2.5% of the UK GDP by 2027-2028, with a further goal of bringing it to 3%. Very exciting, these zero point 0.5 increases in percentages. He has refused to rule out cuts to welfare aid. This follows similar increases to defense spending in countries such as Germany, Something important changing in Europe as it seeks to confront Putin's Russia, or is this just, boring budgetary stuff? Ashley, can you tell us what's going on here, if anything?
It on the one hand, yes, it's boring budgetary stuff, and there's this whole debate about whether or not, it is even realistic or a realistic timeline to increase defense spending, if it's worthwhile or gonna make an impact if you're gonna reach your spending goal by 2035 or whatever it is. On the other hand, there is this big language, about the UK needing to be on a war footing. And I find this to be the most worrisome aspect of this. And commentators for the last couple of days have been occupied by this question of, okay, we want Britain to be on a war footing, but are British civilians ever going to be willing to be on a war footing? What, devotion to king and country is gone now. On what basis will young people go to war? And people were really it was just amazing to hear all these incredibly narcissistic rationales for going to war, but also the most common thing that I heard people saying was, sure now young people don't see any point in this, but once Russia takes a few steps out into Europe, just like happened in World War One, a very similar kind of there was a similar kind of malaise with amongst young people. They really stepped up. They really stepped up. So, you wait, you watch. And it was like they wanted it to happen. Like they couldn't wait. We want Russia to take a few steps to justify this. And we want to spend even more. We want even more of a war economy. We want even more young people to step up to the plate. Why? Why? Well, not for king and country, and Starmer starts saying, like, this is going to be great because by promising to do this and that for the EU, it'll unlock this. I can't remember the exact number, like 300 million funding grant, 500 million funding grant from the EU. Like, really? And we've talked a few times on this podcast about like only blood for oil. This is like only blood for a funding grant from the EU. Like, it's so cynical. And, for a long time, countries have been sort of, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's been this problem of what is the purpose? What are we doing here? There's this vacuum of meaning in in politics, and there have been various kind of silly attempts to fill that vacuum with meaning. I've talked in, obviously in my books about trying to sort of impute politics with like emotion and happiness and well-being economies and all this junk, but it all falls very flat. And there had been since the early 2000s this nostalgia for the Cold War. So, you couldn't, for in the 90s, you had these, if you were looking at films, if you were watching films in the 90s, the bad guys were like um uh Middle Eastern people, right? And then it was like, oh, that's kind of not good. That's a little bit racist. Those Middle Eastern people, they could be your neighbor. And then who was the bad guy? All of a sudden, it was Russians. And this was long before there was any kind of, you know, any fuss with Russia. So it was like, there's an enemy we can get behind. There's an enemy that we like. It's a safe enemy. They're kind of whitish, that sort of thing. Um, and so there's this desire to really, to fill the vacuum of meaning with war. And also, as I've talked about many times before, to fill an economic vacuum with war spending, to sort of drop a country's, produce into the ocean, essentially. Um, and this is what's happening, but without any, it's so interesting because it's without any attempt to find a bigger ideal. At the very beginning of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, you heard people go, "Oh, this is for democracy," and everyone's like, we know you don't care about democracy. You literally just like locked us in our houses for 3 years. We know that that's not true, and now it's just like openly cynical. And I almost feel like Trump cynicism is not as bad somehow, because I think I said this before, that at least it's democratic, whereas Starmer's kind of cynical, let's get on board with the EU's pipe dream of creating a Europe-wide military, is incredibly undemocratic. It is like, oh, we're going to get behind this military that and we're going to sacrifice our young people for this project that our people didn't even choose and aren't even really behind, which has very little purpose. And hey, why are you going to go and do that? It's to unlock a funding grant and, you know, make friends. Like literally, that was the thing that people were saying. It'll be great. You'll go and you'll make friends, and that's why you'll sacrifice your life for your comrades in the military. So you're all going to join the military to die for the people who join the military with you. It's like this awful kind of circular logic. So yeah, I've been finding this whole discussion. It is, yes, on the one hand, silly and boring and just about 3-5% GDP, blah blah blah. But on the other hand, it is getting at a deeper problem of meaning in society, I think.
I wonder if you think that there's any relation to the British elite's concerns about, quote unquote, civil war, their, worries about violence, that surged around the riots last year after the stabbing of the girls in Southport, I believe it was that. And then there was a recent like truck rammed into some people, and initially, once again, it was claimed it was it turned out in this case to be a not somebody of migrant background, but in any case, that there's great worry about internecine violence actually in England, which always strikes me as a bit, I don't know. I mean, when I lived in England, like this just seemed like would have seemed like a very odd idea, but I haven't spent much time there recently. Maybe there's something to it. I don't know. Elon Musk pronounced civil war is inevitable at some point last year. But so I'm curious
He's
whether you think,
generally right,
yeah, and
isn't
he is
he?
generally right about everything still.
Obviously.
So I'm just curious, do you think there's any relation? I mean, Ashley, as a more somebody with much more immersed in the UK than I am, do you think there's sort of a relation to that? Just, whether it's a fantasy slash, sort of paranoid fear, or whether it's based in something like the British elite seems very worried about the potential for um, civil war, or at least, rioting violence. So I don't know, maybe sending them off into the meat grinder, getting some people and sending them off into the meat grinder for Ukraine is a good way of dealing with that threat.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard anybody outright say this, obviously, but this has often been a solution to quote unquote surplus population, people who cannot be used at least profitably by the great machine. Um, so yeah, I'm sure, and also the desire for some kind of uniting enemy, and that's the sort of underlying, that's the subtext of of nostalgia for the Cold War. That obviously everybody says this, it's sort of a basic point, but capitalist society finds it very difficult to justify itself except in relation to an enemy. And when that enemy was gone, you had this legitimation crisis. And so now you have this enemy, and it's a wonderful enemy. It's a perfect enemy because it's like whitish and so on, and it's encroaching on someone else's land. So colonization kind of, it's something that is, if it didn't exist, you'd have to make it up. So it's a really perfect kind of situation, at least in terms of the turmoil that, or the legitimacy crisis, the vacuum of meaning, and so on. And in terms of, you have this population that has no use within. And I'm not saying this like I think no human being, obviously, I think is useless, but that the political class, the government, economics, businesses can't find any use for these people. They're trying to like put them into like these welfare holding cells, and that's it. Yeah, send them off to the meat grinders. The logic, I would imagine. I mean, I haven't seen anybody outright say that.
Superfluous men is the, I believe, originally Russian phrase for this, right? The
Yeah.
is and yeah, anyway, I think that it would be interesting to look into, but there was just a piece recently about, I think, Dominic Cummings, kind of right wing thought leader in the UK, and this kind of broader question of, that the UK elite is deeply concerned about the potential for a real kind of crack up of society that would involve, widespread rioting and so on. And so that there does just seem to be this sense of, yeah, this kind of surplus population, these superfluous young men who might and not only of, I mean, both of sort of sort of white British and minority ethnic backgrounds who might end up kind of fighting each other in the streets. And so, what better way to make them into comrades than to send them off into the trenches together?
There's a really remarkable support for the Ukraine war in the United Kingdom that seems specific to the country and even goes beyond what you find in other European countries. And I don't entirely understand the reasons for that. It seems to, uh, you know, I mean, it's certainly a very strong elite phenomenon. I don't know how far it extends beyond that elite, but um, I asked a prominent British journalist and veteran Politico about this, and he just said it was fundamentally ideological. He doesn't seem to have much respect for the materialism of many compact contributors, but he said, "Look, Britain has always been a, a liberal power, and obviously that's tied to certain commercial features of Britain, geographic features. But he said there's a real uh, allergy to the kind of conservative power that Russia is taken to represent among the among the British elites. So I don't know how that catches out. I will say that broadly in these the way in which conflicts are used to kind of justify certain ideological and political systems, it seems broadly to me, maybe outside the UK, maybe in it too to an extent, that right leaning elites are more keen to talk about potential conflicts with or crises involving uh, kind of Western European legacy populations and migrants from Muslim majority countries or between the West broadly and the Muslim majority world broadly. That's the kind of the clash of civilizations they're interested in discussing, whereas more kind of left leaning elites are more keen to talk about the conflict with Russia because of its status as a conservative power and something that kind of claims a certain Christianity or social conservatism. It allows Europe and the West to kind of embrace its socially liberal identity without kind of raising questions about racism or dislike for others, as Ashley mentioned. Whereas that confrontation with Islam sort of confects an alliance between basically maybe a conservative version of gay pride and a kind of uh, culturally uh, chauvinistic, um, or we could just say culturally tied version of conservative Christianity, right? Um, anyway, it's interesting to observe, and I guess maybe uh, nobody knows what Britain is, but perhaps someone will have to die for it soon. I guess is the
Huh.
idea. We can't exactly define Europe, but maybe that will come after more people start dying for it.
It sounds like right. That's how we find out what it is.
Well, sounds like an excellent way to gain some new information. Uh, I hope it can be avoided. Speaking of Europe, Europeans like to call Americans puritanical, but it is the European Union, not the United States, of a that has launched an investigation of four porn companies. At the heart of the inquiry is the question of whether these companies, including Pornhub, most famous, are adequately guarding minors. Currently, you users only have to click a button saying, "Yes, I'm over 18" to have access to the most extreme forms of obscenity. And Europe wants to limit that. Puritanical? Well, maybe the Puritans have a point. How fully can a minor consent to viewing extreme sexual content? And what right does a company have to profit off of minors' susceptibility to such things? Each of these sites is also what's called a tube company, meaning that it allows users to upload videos, many of which either depict non consensual acts or are shared without the agreement of all parties. The US has complained about other European attempts to regulate big tech. But let me be one American who says, three cheers for the bureaucrats in Brussels.
Never, never. Over my dead body.
Ashley's not so happy about that.
No. Look, we do need to have a conversation about porn. Okay. Like it was like, oh, as a cool girl, I'm supposed to be cool with porn use. It's just a fun and sexy part of an adult relationship. Okay. Maybe back in the day when you had to have some purloined playboys hidden in a forest somewhere and embarrass yourself by walking into the curtained room of some video store. Yes, okay, maybe then. This is not the same thing. Online porn is very, very bad. And you are getting like cases of like young men with erectile dysfunction. Like it is deepening our alienation with each other. It's a bad thing. I say, dear listener, you should probably not engage in it. You should reflect and realize this is having a bad effect on your life. And I know we love to defend our vices, but it's a vice. It's bad for you. But that said, it should absolutely be legal. We need to make a distinction, in its current form. In its current form, click here to say you're 18, and I will explain why. First, we are losing the distinction between saying something is bad and bad for society and saying that it is illegal. I know that obviously law acts to a certain extent to codify our morality, but not all morality must be codified. And this continuation of this trend of like there ought to be a law. It's just such a common thing. There ought to be a law against that. There ought to be a law. Why? Well, we are losing this sense of informal socialization and informal morality that that everything has to be kind of overseen by a bureaucrat or it doesn't happen or it's negative or it's bad. So like parenting is like the most, bureaucrats hate parenting because like, can you imagine the most important thing? You're like teaching the norms and values of your society to children. It's just, you just have kids willy nilly whenever you want. No vetting process. That's insane. You're not even trained. You're not a trained professional. How dare you think you can raise children? And so you have like informal caregiving. That's what they call parents in the EU. And that's obviously less desirable than formal caregiving. So any kind of informal morality, we don't understand it. It's being replaced with like endless bureaucracy, laws, even like medicalization. I've seen this tendency toward medicalization of what used to be just socialization. So different things that you just learn throughout your life that becomes essential parts of your character, which I've written about for Compact before, talking about turn taking conversation, how people are like, oh, I have ADHD, so I do this when I'm having a conversation. It's like, no, conversation is something is learned throughout your life. It's not like, they used to call it the art of conversation. And as we converse less, we are less able to have conversations. It's not, but it becomes like sort of everything becomes codified either medically or in law. So, um, I think we should be able to have rules and prohibitions that are informal. I think you should be able to make a judgment that says, I don't want to use this. This is a bad thing. It's bad for my relationships. It's bad for my dealings with other people. However, that what you mentioned about like protecting children, we have to be careful about this. This is a Trojan horse. It is just so easy to get something passed by saying, okay, because you can make the argument that I have made, which is adults are free to do what they want in a free society. And don't confuse liberty with license. That said, you're free to do it, but that doesn't mean you should do it. Okay. But when it comes to children, then all bets are off. So when people want to limit freedoms, they will often go to children. And how do you protect minors from this kind of content? You need some kind of way of identifying users. And that's the Trojan horse here. It is a way to identify, to get people to use to something like digital ID, something like that. And it's just, and because what monster? Because first of all, nobody wants digital ID, particularly. I don't know if it's a common thing, but I know in the UK, for instance, I posted once. There's a new poll out that says actually Brits are not as opposed to digital ID as you might expect. And I was like, what was the question? Like, would you prefer digital ID or a shovel to the back of the head? And somebody commented, I would still take the shovel. Like, but if you frame it as like protecting children from the horrors of pornography, then what monster is going to argue against that? So I think we have to be very careful that there's on the one hand, we should defend freedom, even in terms of obscenity, because it is much easier and better in a free society to allow obscenity to exist as opposed to trying to regulate it. And also we should be aware that these things are often a smokescreen for a much more sinister agenda.
I want to maybe engage in a little pushback and maybe also a little bullet biting uh, in response to Ashley's really well taken points. One thing, I'm not sure that as our public square has become more permissive in terms of obscenity, that we've become entirely or equivalently more permissive in the kinds of speech we're apt to allow and embrace and defend. So I don't know that there's a kind of uh, liberal impulse that means that restriction of one will necessarily lead to restriction of the other, or that an expansion in the liberty of one will necessarily lead to expansion in the liberty of the other. So that's my pushback. And then maybe the bullet biting I might flirt with is this, though I guess I'm not quite willing to go there. If the kind of nightmare scenario were to come into play where there are digital IDs on the internet, it would change the nature of the internet. It would make it much less valuable um, in various ways, as a means to circumvent kind of old systems of control. But how good is the internet anyway? What if we saw online just become more stultifying and restrictive? But maybe attention would start to flow elsewhere, possibly into channels that are better or no worse. So, yeah, I do have a certain kind of let the EU strangle the internet to death impulse kind of lurking at the back of my mind, but I'm not yet sure I'm willing to go there. So I'm not biting the bullet. I'm sort of nibbling at the edges there.
I sort of think the question raised by Ashley's intervention here is whether it's possible to evolve in the realm of sort of informal, what in German is called Sitten, this sort of customs and norms that are enforced not through kind of top down rules, but through sort of informal, horizontal social dynamics. Obviously, these things, still exist very much, but the internet tends to function as a solvent of these types of things, and it tends not to be a space in which such things can evolve and retain any efficacy. And so, I think maybe part of the problem here is that we're certainly suffering from the sort of anomie that comes from the erosion brought about by these technologies of this very crucial regulatory kind of social dimension. And it's simply just a result of the kind of disembedding of individuals that takes place when they plug themselves into digital spaces as digital avatars. We're disembedded from the social context in which these kind of norms, these kind of tacit norms prevail. And that produces all kinds of things. I mean, it produces potentially, and I think, speaking to what Matthew just said, aspects of these spaces that we find valuable and a source of kind of useful sort of intellectual, aesthetic, et cetera, provocations. But I think it also produces a lot of unfortunate effects as well. And I mean, this is something I've found sort of interesting and have been trying to articulate around the fact that I think social conservatives have been interestingly kind of absent from debate. Like, if you think about debates around things like misinformation or various aspects of the internet that have been seen as kind of socially destabilizing, it strikes me that the people taking the conservative position in the sense of wanting to kind of return to some more stable and hierarchical order have actually been liberals, right, since roughly 2016. But the problem is that they haven't. And I mean, I wrote about this in relation to Chris Hayes's book and Nicholas Carr's book, both works of kind of liberal tech criticism from the past year. but because they don't really have a substantive account of the good, I think their ability to embody that sort of conservative position is relatively weak. So I'd refer people to my Substacks on the Chris Hayes and Nicholas Carr books. Why Tech Criticism Failed is the title of one of them, and the other one is On Attention Capitalism. So this is sort of something I've been thinking about for the past year or two. And the other thing that I think is interesting here is the way that conservatives have been the party of free speech, the party of kind of and not just free speech in the sense of opposing laws and regulations, but free speech in the sense of opposing norms, right? In the sense of opposing of objecting to the idea that communities self-regulate around speech. And so this is quite a striking position for conservatives to take, I would say, because I would think a very fundamental kind of Burkean or like Tocquevillian conservative insight is the centrality and importance of the way communities self-regulate through norms, through tacit norms, customs, and so on. And so it's striking, and the place to look for this is really X, right? Is Elon Musk's platform, the favored platform of the right, which is awash in all kinds of, you know, antisocial, fundamentally antisocial content, and is presided over by a man who is a radical libertine in his personal life in every conceivable respect, and a sort of promoter of a certain kind of libertinism, I would say, in his both his personal and sort of intellectual outlook. And at the same time, it's a platform that is awash in obscenity, vulgarity, and porn, and in fact pornography. This is a necessary consequence of it being, essentially unmoderated, compared to its previous iteration. And so it's striking to me that this is the conservative platform, but it's actually it embodies this spirit of objecting again, not only to and this kind of goes back to Ashley's point, but Ashley was drawing a distinction between top-down bureaucratic regulation and a kind of self-regulation through norms and customs, as I would understand it. It seems to me that the standard right-wing position, at least in the United States, has actually been um, hostile to both modes of regulation, which is a very kind of strange and paradoxical place for conservatism to have arrived, whereas liberalism is only able to, because it has no account of, I would say, substantive goods, it's only able to um, think in terms of top-down bureaucratic regulation, but isn't able to imagine a sort of image of a good community, because it ultimately believes in a kind of laissez-faire morality in which the individual can do whatever he or she likes as long as it doesn't infringe on other individuals or whatever. And so the only account of the good that we get is this top-down bureaucratic account of it. And I think that's partly because that's the only one that the left of center is able to offer, but it's also because I would say the right has really, at least in the context of ideas about speech and expression, has really relinquished its position, and instead stands for this very, in a way, sort of new left, hyper kind of left libertarian, anything goes spirit of just kind of pure provocation and expressive anarchy. So that's kind of how I would think about this situation, which I think is quite strange.
Perhaps here Ashley and I can come into agreement. Uh, More news from Europe. France has fallen, not to Germans with nasty politics and natty uniforms, but to the woke scolds and safety mongers who have decreed that it is no longer legal to smoke in public places where children might be. Is it possible that this attempt to ban cigarettes will be like a chain smoker's attempt to quit? something that is always being decreed and doubled down on but never lastingly put into effect? Will France, like the hero of Italo Svevo's Confessions of Zeno, be forever enjoying its last public cigarette? That I could tolerate. What I fear is that France has surrendered something that makes the world more elegant and sociable in deference to the dubious claims of public health authorities.
Oh, well, I found this to be very sad because I love smoking. I think smoking is great. That's why I don't do it. I'm too Catholic. I'm too Catholic. I can't allow myself to enjoy these things regularly. No, I can't. So I
We're not all worthy of such beauty. I'm in the same boat as you, Ashley. I admire smoking, but don't engage in it. I'm just not cool enough to pull it off.
Well, it's wonderful if you're having like a deep conversation. There's nothing better than leaning back and taking a drag. But I because it's so wonderful, I do it very rarely. And one of the rare occasions is when I am in France, when I am in Paris, which is very rarely, as I said. And I was absolutely gutted because I will be in Paris next week to find that smoking will be banned in outdoor public spaces. But I am saved by the fact that it is coming into effect from the 1st of July. Now, you know, it's it, even though I do enjoy smoking, I kind of understand, not around children, etc. But this is kind of chipping away. It's a chipping away, and it's got to be. The French government knows that if they're going to try to attempt to stop French people from smoking, because like still 1 in 4 French people smoke, they're going to have to chip away at it slowly. Slowly, slowly, slowly. So it's a slow erosion, but there are limits. You can still smoke outside in a cafe, which is so part of French culture. So, at least they have this recognition that that's something important. Um, but yeah, it's a chipping away at that last kind of freedom, the freedom to destroy your own body at will. And of course, the way that they do this and have done this for decades is by, again, that everybody knows that your freedom ends. Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my face begins, right? And so they will use, again, children as a way to kind of, well, okay, you have the people, because people would say, well, I have the freedom to destroy my body as I choose, and they would bring in all this junk about public health and blah blah blah, even though taxes usually cover this. But again, the trump card is children, children, and there you go. Now we will take and now French culture, French smoking culture, so integral to French society, takes the ultimate blow. And I think that's sad. I think that's sad. And you know what's great about Greece? When the smoking bans came into effect, I don't think I have ever seen more smoke in cafes. And it's this wonderful kind of like irreverence for authority that Greek people still have. And I think that is a testament to the wonderful fighting spirit, not of Europe, but of Europeans. So I hope that there will be never more smoke on a beach than on the day this ban takes effect.
So Ashley has graciously not directly called me out for accepting arguments about harms to children in the case of pornography and basically just waving them away when it comes to smoking. Um, so thank you, Ashley. But let me offer a kind of defense to listeners who've noticed this seeming inconsistency and just outrageous hypocrisy on my part. Part of my social conservatism, such as it is informed by a religious perspective. That I think it need not be strictly religious. That rates spiritual harms as graver and to be taken more seriously than physical harms. So I'm just more concerned about you know my my own children, say, encountering intense, violent, obscene pornography, at a young age and being basically sexually educated and informed by it, than I am about them inhaling puffs of secondhand smoke. In other words, I fear the death of the soul more than that of the body. But so that's my defense against probably something Ashley was wondering, even though Ashley's very nice. She didn't quite say.
No, I'm sympathetic. I get it.
I guess I'll support the smoking ban. I I don't
Well,
know.
you're
Good,
gonna
good.
piss.
Someone has to do
It
it.
goes back a bit to my points about norms and customs, which is one thing that's happened in New York and other American cities in recent years is a lot of cannabis smoking in the streets. And something that I find interesting about that is that there are no inherited norms and customs about it, right? Because it was a thing that was entirely private until relatively recently. And so the question of how the public sort of regulates these these types of consumption that have a kind of secondhand effect, not just not necessarily in measurable public health terms, but just the smell of it, is something that you notice and that affects you. And so I don't know. I tend to think, even though certainly yeah, I mean, I was a smoker when I was younger. I sort of occasionally indulge in more recent years, but for the most part, don't anymore. And I do find it kind of gross. I remember after I quit when I was younger, there were still at least some places where people smoked in bars, and it was just disgusting. I mean, it was just genuinely disgusting. And I do think when you have a population, the majority of which is non-smoking, it's just eventually going to come about that people are not going to want to have to be subjected to that. Now, maybe there's a way of regulating that through custom and norms rather than through top-down bureaucratic rules, as we were talking about before. But overall, probably not. And these smells are quite pungent. They tend to take over a space, even if a minority of people are indulging. And so I don't know. It seems like maybe I always think about the fact that my all four of my grandparents were pretty heavy smokers, which I think is typical of America in that era. And despite being from like different social classes and backgrounds and stuff like that, what they all had in common was they were heavy smokers. And so back then it was kind of different, and people smoke. My parents remembered like going to the supermarket with their parents, and they were like smoking in the aisles, and there were like ashtrays on the shopping carts and stuff. But so things were different back then. So I don't know. It sort of seems to me, even though through my kind of Foucauldian, Illichian critiques of public health, sort of bureaucratic rationality and so on, I'm disposed to be critical of this. I tend to think probably just through democracy, people are eventually going to agree that these are things you should indulge in private and not bother other people with. So that's my strongest case. I'm not particularly passionate here, but that's how I would make the case for this development.
I'm going to run downstairs, find a nearby playground, and light a Cuban cigar in defiance of the public health nanny statism and Cold War hysteria that governs American life. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, listeners. Thanks to Stephen Adebato and Anna Wetzel, our producers. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.